Hello, I'm Mike Helmar of the University Center for Economic Development at the University of Nevada, Reno. I would like to welcome you to the Alfalfa and Grass Hay Price Outlook session of the Herds and Harvest Workshop Dealing with Drought. This outlook is based on the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute's U.S. and international baseline projections, which were released on March 13, 2014. The U.S. Outlook was developed at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and the International Outlook was developed at the University Center for Economic Development at the University of Nevada, Reno. Next chart, impacting the price outlook. Let's begin by discussing several of the major factors that will affect the hay price outlook for 2014 and beyond. In producing the outlook, we assume that the drought will end. This is a standard assumption as we cannot predict the weather. This is one of the primary risks to the outlook. If the drought does indeed not end, hay prices could be considerably higher than what we have here. Certainly we have gotten some moisture in the past month or so, but nobody is calling our seasonal moisture a drought breaker. The issue is not just that we are in a drought, but that it is a multi-year drought. For many regions in the West, and especially for Nevada, the end to an extended drought does not guarantee that sufficient water will be available. Reservoir storage is well below capacity, and this is a vital source of water for the growing season, especially for ranchers and farmers that depend on surface water. Even if the drought has ended, we are not out of the woods yet. While the recent moisture will contribute to the spring flush of grass growth, is the subsurface moisture enough to sustain rangelands and pastures to provide the required feed for cattle and sheep? If not, another year of increased supplemental feeding will keep pressure on hay demand and prices. The question is not just how much hay acreage will be harvested this year, it is also how much damage was done to hay acres last year. Will they recover? What about new plantings? The impacts of the drought on hay acreage could last for several years, even with normal or better precipitation. Aside from the impacts of the drought on hay supplies, a major shift in demand is developing for Nevada. Milk processing will require increased milk production and feed utilization as the state's dairy industry targets foreign markets with value-added products like whole milk powder. If precipitation is not sufficient to reduce fire hazard this year compared to the past couple of years, the potential for cattle to be displaced from public grazing lands remains great. Ranchers have several options, none of which they particularly like. One is to move to other grazing lands if available. Others include replacing grazing with hay feeding or to liquidate their herds. There are regional implications as much of Nevada's hay is marketed in California. Retaining hay grown in Nevada for rising local demand and the ongoing decline in California alfalfa production will create upward pressure regionally. Next chart. Improved supplies ease crop prices. On a national average, crop prices are coming down significantly from the highs of the past few years. The blue and red lines are corn and soybean prices. The drought has eased in major crop-growing areas such as the Corn Belt and Southern Plains, and production recovered to the point that there were record harvests of important grains and oilseeds last fall, pushing prices lower. But the hay prices are hanging a little higher this year on a national average than grain and soybean prices, as shown by the green line. Part of the reason is that western states produce a much larger proportion of hay than other states, and therefore have a much larger impact on national hay prices than on national grains and oilseeds. Even as hay production has recovered elsewhere, drought persists in the West, impacting hay production here and keeping the local and national average prices higher. With several years of normal or better precipitation, hay prices are expected to follow other feed crops' prices downward. However, increasing demand from livestock production and higher costs of production than before the price run-up will keep hay and other feed prices elevated compared to the period before 2006. Next chart, weather, WMP plant influence hay outlook. All of Nevada's hay crops are irrigated. As a result, 1 year of drought has much less impact on production here than in rain-fed regions because of the water storage system and use of groundwater. But subsequent years of drought will reduce the quantity of water stored and therefore available for irrigating the crop. In addition, several years of severe drought can lower groundwater. This is the predicament Nevada hay growers are facing this year. As a result, the usual relationship of Nevada hay prices with national average hay prices has been altered in the short run. Nevada alfalfa prices are expected to remain high, although under $200 per ton in 2014, before declining to around $160 in 2015 and for a few years beyond that time. Grass hay is projected to drop from approximately $190 per ton in 2013 to a still high $170 this year before falling off to $150. These are prices received by the grower at his or her gate, so they do not include transportation or brokerage fees. The red line is alfalfa and the blue line is grass hay prices. Especially noticeable for Nevada alfalfa is that 2004 prices, although slightly lower than those for last year, remain elevated. National average prices, on the other hand, are expected to decline more in line with other feed costs this year. Even if normal precipitation develops, hay production is likely to be constrained. While there is not an ironclad relationship between hay prices and private pasture grazing fees, the green line, the pasture fees generally mimic those of hay, especially in the medium to long term. Because of the continued high hay prices, private pasture grazing fees are expected to also remain elevated through this year, as all forage supplies are expected to remain tight. It must be noted that not all of the higher prices of the past few years and the price strength that might remain in the future is a result of drought-induced short supplies. The demand side is also set to contribute upward price pressure. The Fallon whole milk powder plant will utilize 2 million pounds of milk per day when fully operational. The dairy herd expansion required to meet that increased demand will result in a huge increase in hay fed to the Northern Nevada dairy herd. If all the milk utilized by the plant is Northern Nevada sourced, as is expected, it will result in an approximate doubling of the dairy herd in the north part of the state, and therefore a doubling of feed requirements. However, this outlook was developed without incorporating an increase in the dairy herd. Therefore, the hay price levels shown for the future are likely on the low side of the range expected, especially since land and water for hay area expansion are limited. Next chart, irrigation keeps yields up. The surface water storage system and wells allow water from previous years to be utilized in subsequent drought years, helping to maintain crop productivity. The yields per acre of alfalfa and grass hay in Nevada have exhibited relatively low volatility despite substantial variance in rainfall from year to year as existing water supplies are used, as opposed to depending on precipitation falling during the growing season, which would be far insufficient to produce a hay crop in Nevada. Even in the past few years of droughts, hay yields have not fallen as much as they would have when drought occurs in regions where hay crops are primarily rain-fed and therefore subject to annual precipitation variation. On average, statewide alfalfa yields are around 4.5 tons per acre, while grass hay is about 1.6 to 1.7 tons per acre. So how can we be running out of water and still maintain hay yields? Is there enough stored and enough groundwater to meet irrigation needs? The chart we are looking at can be deceiving. Yes, hay yields have been more or less maintained, but yield is calculated as production per harvested acre. This is only one side of the story of the past few years. Next chart, drought reduces irrigated acres, number of cuttings. In Nevada, if there was no irrigation, there would be no hayland or production. This is the other half of the story. As water has become scarcer, irrigation has been pulled back and fewer acres have been harvested. This allows those acres that are irrigated to receive adequate water to maintain more or less normal yields. The rest of the land-devoted hay crops may not have been irrigated or irrigated insufficiently to produce a usual crop. So while yields are being maintained, that is occurring on smaller and smaller acreage. Since 2010, Nevada hay acreage has fallen by approximately 1/4 for alfalfa and 1/3 for grass hay. In the multi-year drought, water availability has become insufficient to produce second or third cuttings in some areas where those normally occur. Are there consequences beyond foregoing a crop for a year? If so, the impacts will extend to subsequent years. If a hay stand is allowed to die off, there will be no crop until it can be replanted. This brings up another issue, and that is the planting of new hay fields. Did producers rotate and establish new crops as they normally would have, or have they held off because of lack of water in the past few years? Data on hay plantings lags a couple of years, so that information is not readily available for the past year. But it is likely that it will take several years for hay production in Nevada to recover from the effects of the drought and help ease regional prices. Next chart. California losing alfalfa acres. California has been losing alfalfa acres for the past decade, and that shrinkage has accelerated since 2008 as that state is also faced with severe water shortages. Since California beef and dairy producers, equine, and other livestock operators are all dependent on hay, especially alfalfa, shrinking supplies in California boost regional prices and pulls hay westward from Nevada. While this creates a strong market for hay producer, Nevada livestock and dairy producers are faced with higher costs. In addition to water shortages, California agriculture is subject to competition from land from population growth and expanding urban-suburban areas. Property values bid land away from agriculture, especially for hay, a relatively low-valued crop by California standards. Encroaching development eats into crop areas. As this continues to occur, California must increasingly look outside its borders for meeting hay demand. This contrasts to 2010, the red line, and 2011. Next chart. Late year moisture improves range. This is a bit of an optimistic sounding title. Improvement or worsening at the end of one season can have little to do with the initial range conditions in the next year. This chart shows a calculated range condition index based on 0 equals very poor, 25 equals poor, 50 equals fair, 75 equals good, and 100 equals excellent. This data is based on range and pasture conditions from the first week of May through the last week of October. It's published by the USDA. It should be noted that several observations in the purple line towards the end of 2013 are missing. This is the time period that coincides with the government shutdown in September of last year. In 2013, the purple line were far below average, the light blue line in the middle of the chart, and they were generally poor in the last 2 years. This contrasts to 2010, the red line, and 2011, the dark blue line, when range and pasture conditions were considerably better than normal throughout the season. The condition of the range has several very important implications for hay prices. Poor forage condition or low density result in insufficient feed for cattle. In such circumstances, cattle producers may have to make use of or increase supplemental feeding of hay. Furthermore, range conditions are often associated with moisture levels, among other factors. In dry years, the fire danger is quite high, and like the past 2 years, extensive wildland fires have occurred. When grazing land is burned over, cattle must be removed, often for a period of 2 or more years. The grazing area may require several years before plant density and growth are adequate to place cattle back on it. Ranchers may decide to feed hay in place of some of the lost forage, further boosting already high demand for hay and pressuring local prices higher. After 2 years of well below average health of the range, even with normal precipitation, it could take some time before range conditions return to an average level. Next chart. Profitability depends on water in 2014. Okay, so profitability depends on water every year. And from the chart, it appears that gross revenues per acre for alfalfa will again be well above operating costs, implying good profitability for hay producers. If you look on the area of the chart, above the blue bars and below the black line, that is what represents the profitability or the returns over operating costs. But again, this chart is based on a harvested acre. Any expenses sunk into acreage that is not harvested, including acres on which additional cuttings are foregone, are not measured in this particular view. If we recall the harvested acres chart, about 1/4 of alfalfa and 1/3 of grass hay acres disappeared in Nevada between 2010 and 2013. Yet it is certain that some management work and inputs were devoted to at least some of that land during that time with no return. As such, these uncovered costs erode the bottom lines of hay producers, even with high prices for hay. In addition, fixed costs further erode profitability. However, as we return to expected normal precipitation in the years after 2014, even with accompanying lower hay prices, hay production is still expected to remain profitable. Next chart. Cattle prices boosted by low inventories. Drought elsewhere also affects agriculture in Nevada. The drought that occurred in the southern plains for 2 years contributed to the earlier run-up in hay prices, as well as cattle prices. Prior to that drought in that major cattle-producing region, cattle inventories were already at the low point of the cycle. With the drought, there was some liquidation of herds, pushing inventories even lower. Cattle prices that were already relatively high are now at records today and are expected to go even higher in the next 2 years before herd expansion substantially increases the number of fed cattle available for slaughter. Because of the tight inventory and prices that signal good economic conditions for herd expansion, the draw on western cow-calf operations to supply feeder cattle has boosted prices in this region as well. The green line is Nevada feeder steer prices, and the red line is the national average feeder steer price. Cattle prices are expected to top out in 2015, yet remain elevated for several years after that time. Preliminary USDA data indicate that cattle inventories in Nevada in 2014 show a decline of 5,000 head from last year and 15,000 head from the beginning of 2012, following several years of expansion. This decline coincides with the current drought despite favorable cattle prices. Next chart. Strong prices will support profitability. Nevada ranchers should enjoy a period of solid profitability leading to herd expansion, providing there is sufficient grazing as well as sufficient hay for winter feeding. Because of the heavy dependence on public grazing lands, Nevada cattlemen are generally less exposed to price fluctuations in purchase feeds. The blue portion of the bar is the amount of operating costs that are attributable to purchase feeds, including hay. They indicate that while spending on purchase feeds increased after 2010, this category still remains small compared to other costs. While there was some impact on the bottom line of ranchers, it did not wipe out profitability in the last few years because there was a corresponding sharp rise in cattle prices during that period that more than offset the increase in purchase feed costs. Going forward, the decline in feed costs will contribute to higher profitability, but the still high and increasing cattle prices expected during the expansionary phase of the cattle cycle will have the largest impact on profits. Strong prices allowed beef cattle producers to absorb higher feed costs in the past few years. It is expected that the high price environment will persist, creating opportunity for expansion for western cow-calf producers in coming years, although lower expected hay prices will make a small contribution as well. Next chart. Milk prices will fall as feed prices ease. Milk prices regained most of the 2012 losses in 2013 and are expected to remain elevated this year before easing in 2015. However, milk prices will remain high enough to induce continued expansion of herds and milk production, particularly in the western states. Dairy production has been expanding in the West for several decades, locating near areas of the highest population growth in the nation. The major factor in declining milk prices will be lower feed costs as grains and protein meals have fallen from recent peak levels. Hay prices, also a major component of dairy rations, are expected to weaken only modestly this year, but then fall further in the middle of the decade. As feed costs continue to ease, dairy producers will be able to absorb the decline in milk prices and still maintain healthy margins. The dairy margin insurance of the 2014 Farm Bill will only provide Nevada dairymen limited protection. There are two main issues. The first is that the elimination of the supply management feature could allow margins to decline for several months as no production adjustment mechanism is built into dairy policy. Together with payment limitations that are targeted at providing less support to larger dairies like those in the West, extended periods of low margins are not able to be offset to the same extent for Western producers as for the smaller farms in other parts of the country. However, the level of basic margin protection is not designed to be sufficient to keep production profitable by itself during periods of low prices. Ultimately, producers will adjust milk production based on net returns. The next chart. Profitability expected to return in 2014. Dairy producers have a much larger dependence on purchased feed than cow-calf producers and are therefore more exposed to fluctuation in grain, protein meal, and hay prices. Even as other feed prices have fallen, hay prices remain stubbornly high. The expectation of return to normal weather in major crop-producing regions in both the U.S. and around the world is behind the partial easing of crop, including hay, grain, and oilseed prices in the outlook. If hay production does not recover as expected in the next year, costs for dairy producers will be higher than those in these projections. The blue bar segments are purchased feed costs, like in the cow-calf chart. Recall that in that chart, purchased feed is a relatively small component of operating costs. In contrast, for dairy, it has been well over 50% and is expected to remain nearly half in the outlook. Even with somewhat lower milk prices in the outlook, the decline in feed costs will allow profitability to return to dairy production beginning this year. However, if alfalfa and grass hay prices, major component of dairy costs, do not exhibit the declines projected, these costs will remain elevated and continue to squeeze dairy producers. Nevada is at a crucial stage, especially in northern Nevada. The expansion in dairy herds that will be needed to supply the whole milk powder plant will require an extended period of profitability to induce establishment of new herds, growth in old ones, or movement of existing ones to the state. Dairy expansion will boost hay and other feed demand and provide upward support to hay prices, somewhat mitigating profitability. If feed prices rise too much, however, it could hamper the growth of the dairy industry in Nevada. The period where we have profitability returning to data is 2014 and later, which is exactly the period that we were expecting ramp up in the whole milk powder plant. This period of profitability is very important to meeting the needs of milk production for that plant. Next chart, wrap up. Nevada hay production and prices will be impacted by a variety of factors. Let's summarize. During and following a multi-year drought, water shortages may be more severe than in a single-year drought. Storage is well below capacity at this time and might not recover sufficiently for full water allocations this year and beyond. Range conditions have a long way to go to recover and might not be adequate to carry stocking levels this year. This raises the question of whether increased hay feeding will be required again. Another dry year and severe fire season will push more cattle off grazing lands. Will cattlemen feed more hay or liquidate, or some combination of the two? Nevada dairy expansion will boost demand for hay and hay prices. This is a great opportunity for hay producers. California continues to pull Nevada hay westward, giving producers an expanding market. With the Fallon whole milk powder plant going into operation, dairy herd expansion will retain some of that westward bound hay. This will lead to some regional impacts beyond Nevada's borders. Next chart, the contact information. This presentation can be accessed on the University Center for Economic Development website at the link below. For more information or questions regarding this outlook, please contact Mike Helmar at mhelmar@cabnr.unr.edu. Thank you.